Claire, welcome to the show.
Thank you. I'm glad to be here.
Yeah, well, you had reached out to me and you had listened to some of my podcast. I think you were listening to my Digital Money Advisor show, which was
Mhm.
focused more on the crypto side. And you said, hey, wait a minute. I think we need to talk about the human side here and not just talk about all this technology. And I said, I think that makes total sense. But I think between now and success is probably the more appropriate podcast to have you on. So we want to talk about this topic. So you sent me the title here. So the topic of what you want to talk about today is what?
Is about being intentionally human. This is really what I love about being a financial planner. And the more I think about the profession and what I'm diving into in terms of getting better at, I see the future of the financial profession moving in the direction of us actually becoming experts, or at least very skilled in understanding what it means to be human and how to communicate that with our clients.
Okay. So I'm going to ask you a deeply philosophical question here. Are you ready?
Sure. Yes, I'm ready.
What does it mean to be human?
Well, I don't have an answer for that yet, but I do realize that it's an incredibly complicated question. And whatever the answer is, it flies in the face of the idea that idea of the rational investor in the market. So we have behavioral finance. I would argue that behavioral finance is finance. So there is this growing idea that emotions and experiences in our past have effects on the actions that we do, but there's so many layers and there's so much that's particular about us. And as technology continues to do more of the research, the trades, the technical side, what's going to be left is dealing with the humanity piece and the work of developing skill sets around some of the things that we can at least understand or go through is going to be of primary importance. And I can provide some pretty simple examples if you'd like.
Yeah, and I'm with you 100% on this idea. Where I struggle is as technology progresses, what we thought at one point was, okay, this is purely human. Technology, a computer, a robot cannot take this over. Well, now we're finding with AI, with machine learning, some of these advances, things that we used to think were uniquely human, now we've got computers that can do them. So is there one or two or three things where you would say today, as I understand technology today, and as I understand what it means to be a human, what would be the things that we as humans are uniquely set up for that no technology is ever going to be able to duplicate what we do, or at least maybe they can duplicate it, but they can't do it as well as a human can?
Right. That's a great question. And I'm glad that you asked it. I'm going to back up a step and say that I love thinking about the future and future trends. And I read this great book by Chuck Klosterman called But What If We're Wrong? Imagining the Present as Though It Were the Past. And he makes a good point, which is we're almost always wrong. So I might very well be wrong. But when I think about all of the aspects of what I do in my job as a financial planner, thinking about the messiness of a human and the fact that we don't really acknowledge the messiness, I since we don't have such a great grasp on that as a society, I see it difficult to embed it into technology. And one example I'll give is grief. I think that our culture, at least, here, at the Western culture, the idea of dealing with death, it's something that we know we're going to have to deal with, but we don't have a lot in place for how to deal with, and we don't talk a lot about grief. And as financial advisors, we know that this is a part of the transition of life. We call it the end of the plan as this euphemism. But because our culture is so poor at even talking about it en masse, it's difficult for me to envision that we'll be good enough to implement that into some sort of algorithm.
And I've seen some research. Now, this isn't related to grief, but it does get to the idea of emotion. So I know some people have said that, like psychotherapy, for example, that you're probably not going to be able to automate that, but they've already done some research where they've programmed a robot or a computer to have a dialogue in a psychotherapy type session, and the outcome of that was that the patient actually felt better talking to the robot than they did talking to another human. Of course, they did all the, the appropriate trials and everything to make sure that, hopefully there weren't biases in there. But what I
Right.
think they concluded was that they felt like the computer was not judging them. Whereas when they talked to a human psychotherapist, they felt like there might have been some judgment in there. So we had some of these human biases. So let's talk about, well, first of all, have you heard anything about that particular study? Any observation on that?
No, I haven't, but I find that fascinating. I already have a couple questions that bubble to the surface in thinking about that, and perhaps my hypothesis about the humanness being conducted by the advisor is not correct, but getting to making a person feel comfortable is what I think is going to be key. And if it is machines, okay, but the advisor is likely to be in that role for a good time to come. And so I would really want to understand why that person felt more comfortable with the robot. Thinking about judgment makes me add another skill set to what we as advisors should work on in terms of how we can communicate in a way to create an open space. I think that's a great example of one of the things we should intentionally work on, how we can communicate in a way that indicates we're not passing any sort of judgment on their whatever they have to share with us. And so I do think there's some sort of back and forth that we can learn from technology to us. I think it will be some sort of collaboration. So I appreciate you bringing that up. It makes me think about even more ways that we have room as advisors to get better at connecting with other people.
Yeah. And I think one of the ways to do that is it's easy for us to go into a conversation with a client or with a potential new client, and we bring all of our own baggage to that conversation. We bring our own thoughts, our own biases to the conversation. And it's easy for us to project our issues onto our client or to try and interpret our client's issues in the same frame of our own issues. And so I think one of the keys, and this is I'll call it a technique, maybe that's not the right word, but something that we can practice along this lines of how do we not have judgment, is to go into the conversation and start with nothing. Meaning just say, look, I'm going to be a blank slate. I'm going to be a blank canvas. I'm not going to go in with any of my own ideas. I'm not going to go in with some understanding of what I've learned about this client from the information that they've already filled out or the 15-minute conversation I had with them earlier. I'm just going to start with nothing. And then let's just see where this goes. I'm not going to make any assumptions. I'm not going to fill in the blanks. If they tell me something, I'm not going to extrapolate and think, oh, well, that must mean this because I've seen that pattern before in other people. Don't, just deal with what they've given me, deal with the reality, deal with what they've told me. And if you have any blank spots, then you ask them to fill in the blanks as opposed to you just doing it yourself and making assumptions.
I think that that's a great approach, and how to get to a place of being open, being curious, not going in with preconceived ideas. It's both work that we have to do on ourselves as humans. So that's why I sort of started with that, the big, almost cliche question of what it means to be human, because part of it is understanding ourselves and understanding how we can mitigate our own behaviors to be more present for other people. And I had another thought about the psychotherapy. One of the benefits we get of connecting human to human, which this whole COVID situation has shown that we really do crave that human to human contact. And I'm bringing up grief again because it is something that I have had some experience with. There is something about talking to another person who understands that kind of big, messy emotion that might make people feel more comfortable. A lot of people have expressed talking to someone else who has quote unquote been through something similar makes them feel more at ease. And when you have gone through something like that, you can develop skills around it about being comfortable with silence, for example, or knowing that people who have been grieving, maybe they just want to talk, not about finance at all, but just they want to, you ask some open-ended questions and allow them to share whatever they'd like to share. I would have never known that had I not experienced, I lost my father 4 years ago. And actually right before that happened, I was in a presentation, I was at a conference, and I heard Amy Florian speak, whose business is basically about getting professionals to understand the difficulties with hard life transitions. So I learned a lot from her presentation, and 4 months later, I needed to put her skills into practice. So I'm curious, trying to implement that here. I'm wondering if sitting across the table from another human, someone who also might have struggled with money, who also has to deal with these kinds of questions, might actually create some sort of trust.
Yeah, well, the thing with grief, and I do want to explore that here just a little bit,
Oh, sure.
is what's a little, I don't know if irony is the right phrase or the right word, but financial advisors have lots of clients. They tend to work with people who are older. So if you're in the business for 10, 20, 30 years, you're going to be dealing with a lot of grief because your clients are going to be passing away. So you're going to have a lot of experience in dealing with grief. Now, that doesn't mean you're effective at it. You might have the same experience 50 times as opposed to really experiencing each one as a unique situation. So what are some of the things that you've learned, and also from your personal experience of losing your father?
Mhm.
How should financial advisors deal with a client who has just lost a spouse, let's say? What is the role for the advisor in that particular situation? Because we're not grief counselors per se,
Of
but we have to
course.
deal with it. So yeah, so what should we be doing as an advisor?
Well, I see there being two categories: things that are helpful, and then things that are not helpful. And learning both are really useful. We have the technical knowledge about the paperwork that needs to get signed and how to transfer the accounts and how you can roll over the IRAs, et cetera, et cetera. But when someone is grieving, paperwork is not going to be something that could be incredibly difficult for somebody to deal with. And so what we as advisors can do is, one, start with compassion. It's good to know your boundaries. So we are not grief counselors, but start with compassion, not be afraid of the big emotions. I think that's key. There are a lot of people who kind of want to avoid it, not talk about it. Be upfront about it. I heard someone once say, "Oh, I didn't want to ask you about your father passing because I didn't want to bring it up and make you upset." If someone has just lost someone very important to them, I doubt there's any moment of any day when they have forgotten that they just had this big loss. So I would softly challenge those people. Just, is it your fear about bringing it up, or is it actually about concern for the client? So I would suggest gentle, open-ended questions. And again, a lot of this I learned from Amy Florian and then experienced it myself. You know, would you like to talk about what's happened or how you're doing today? Or Amy Florian suggested this, and I love it. What's one thing you wish people knew about what you're dealing with? Or what's the one question you wish people asked you? As a sort of sidestep way to not directly ask a question or try to put together a question that you think is going to, be the best constructed question, but let them know you're interested in hearing what they want to say. And then after that, sort of laying that compassion and creating that space for the person to be allowed to be upset, saying, "Okay, listen, there's some paperwork, but what I'm going to do as the advisor is I am just going to concentrate on what needs to happen right now. We just do the very immediate things. I will stay on top of this. You don't have to think about the timeline. Whatever you could do as the advisor in terms of organizing things, being able to take the initiative, whatever you can do to put less work on that person and break it down into bite-sized pieces. We as advisors can do that. And I have to say, after my father's passing, all of the logistical paperwork stuff, it was a horrible process. There was only one professional who had any sort of humanness to her interactions with us. And it was actually the person who probated the will, who deals with this all the time. That's her job. And yet she was still compassionate and warm and had quotes on her wall. She was just willing to engage. And then in terms of some things, maybe not to say or not to do.
Can I stop you there for just a
Sure.
second?
Yeah, sure.
Before you talk about the things not to say, I want to explore this last thing that you just said about the only person who was really compassionate was the probate person. So the advisor, your father had an advisor, is that correct?
Yeah, on not a financial planner per se, but yeah, there was a representative on his AXA account.
And that person you're suggesting didn't really have the level of compassion that you would have liked to have seen?
It was fine. It was fine to difficult. So particularly actually in getting my father had elected to have 75% of his pension, should he die first, go to my mother. And the process of actually getting that to happen, because it included healthcare as well, was very difficult. We were required to find a fax machine. If someone's grieving and you're on the phone and you
what's
waited,
a fax machine?
you waited 30 minutes on hold, and then someone says the only way to submit the paperwork is via fax. I mean, come on. That's right. It feels so unfair. And I do have to say, after going through this, it does provide me with motivation to try to make the process better. What can we do to make it less work? What can we do? I understand there are regulations and you have to prove that someone has passed and have documentation, but what can we do to just make this less terrible?
So what I want to ask is, do you think, and I don't want to single out this particular advisor, let's just kind of talk advisors in general. Do you think that, generally speaking, advisors are more focused on efficiency? Like, hey, I just want to get through this. I want to get on to my next client. Or do you think that this is the real opportunity to be human, to show your humanness, to show the compassion, to show, here's what I can do as a human that you're not going to get at a robo-advisor, or you're not going to get at some technology solution. So any thoughts on that?
Yeah. Well, first, I don't want to, the advisor on that account he did reach out. He wasn't, he wasn't a robot.
I'm not throwing him on the bus.
No, I know. So instead I'll say the pension situation and then the person in charge of the life insurance. So I'm going to focus on those things. I don't want to throw the guy under the bus. Efficiency is good when efficiency is called for, but with something that is so big, such as grief, advisors we have to do more. And I think, I don't think that it has to be a choice between efficiency and compassion. What I think is that advisors for so long have been able to run their practices without being encouraged to have to do this, because they've been able to get enough of a client base and keep enough of a client base to do business as usual. So I don't think there's really been a push for them to need to do it. I think it's the right thing to do, but I also think as the industry changes, as everything changes, we are going to have to do it, because we are going to be the differentiators in terms of being the one establishing the relationship as opposed to looking up equities or something like that.
Okay. So what are some of the things we should not do when it comes to dealing with a client in a grieving situation?
Yeah. Well, one of the things that has been actually hardest for me is try not to say I'm sorry. There are ways to do it that show emotion and compassion. However, the point was made during a presentation I attended that when you say I'm sorry, it requires a response from the other person, as though they need to say something to acknowledge it. And often the only thing you can say is thank you. And it's a very bizarre, you're not giving them anything, you're apologizing and they need to respond. And so it's a very closed type of interaction. So again, saying this must be really hard, I'm thinking of you, or something where you are communicating in a way that you are giving and don't need a response is often a lot more helpful, often a lot more easily absorbed by the person, so they don't feel the need to have to give anything back or say thank you or I appreciate your concern. Some more obvious one, and again, if you say I'm sorry and you say it in a way that conveys your emotion, I'm certainly not telling people don't ever say it, but there are better ways to offer your just to say that you feel you want to help and you want to send them love. Some more obvious ones, but still worth saying, is calling the loss a blessing. That can be really hard unless the grieving person says something like that first. It can be really tough to make a determination that what just happened is a good thing, even if the person who passed was in pain. Comparing your own hardship, that can be really tricky. Again, there's a way to connect with people, but especially early on, at least for me personally, it was very difficult when other people shared difficulties either they were going through or had gone through recently, because I didn't have anything to give. The emotion was just so big. I mean, it really did sort of turn my understanding of what it means to be a person upside down. The feeling is just so big and so overwhelming. Daily tasks are very difficult. And because it's so big, when people try to ignore it or pretend it didn't happen because they don't want to upset you, I think that was the hardest of all. People who just tried to not talk about it. Because how could you not talk about something that has just really changed your world in a very permanent way?
Yeah. So this whole area of grief, as you've been describing here, it's a very key area for advisors to really I'm going to say get better at. And I don't want that to sound crass, because it's not like it's a skill I have to practice per se, but it's about the compassion. It's about being more human. I think the things that you've just shared here are excellent. And then Amy Florian as well would be a great person to learn some more about this as well. And of course, we do have our own personal experiences in how we've dealt with this. So clearly that's a way that our humanity comes out. So let's talk.
Can I challenge you on that, Steve?
Sure. Sure.
I don't think it's crass to say that that it can be a skill for us to work on. I think that there are ways for us to seek out learning opportunities and to try to intentionally learn more about the process in a way we might learn about how to, how life insurance works. So just a soft challenge on the fact that we can seek out opportunities to learn more about it. And I would encourage people to do so.
Yeah. And I think the distinction is we have to come to it from a place of authenticity, as opposed to, oh, I heard on a podcast that I need to be more compassionate for my grieving clients. Now, that's obviously cold, and I doubt anyone listening to this is going to approach it from that angle. But really trying to be more in touch of our own humanity, our own compassion. And while, yes, that is something that we can absolutely practice, but I think the place from which we approach that, I think, is important.
Yeah, and it's okay if it doesn't go, very smooth. I think the fact that people try, it's okay. I heard this in a podcast, and so I don't say I'm sorry, and instead I say I'm thinking about you. Would you like to share anything with me? And if it's clunky, okay, okay, it's better than just ignoring it because you're afraid you're going to mess it up.
Right. No, I think that's really good. Great. All right. So let's talk a little bit about the communication piece. So how does that enhance our humanity, or how does that help make us more human relative to robots or AI?
Yeah, communication. So much revolves around communication. My father was a teacher, my wife is a teacher, and when we think about what it is we're doing as advisors, particularly because it's almost its own language, um, I see communication as essentially four different parts. There's the idea that you want to communicate in your head as the person who's going to be trying to send this communication to your client. So you have the idea, then you need to think about how you're going to deliver it. And it could be client specific, based on their knowledge of the financial field, whether it is they're new or they have been in the investing world for a long time. But the way that we share that idea is important. Then there's going to be the way that the client hears it, and they might hear it all different ways depending on how they're feeling, if they're hungry, if the meeting's gone 2 hours over. And then there's what idea actually rests in their head once they leave the meeting. And the fact that it's a process is what I want to try to communicate, no pun intended.
That's how I'm hearing it.
Not that we say something out in the world like some very boring lecturer and just expect that it's going to be absorbed. Communication is a process with a skill set, and you have to be intentional about how you say something or how you convey that idea in the hopes that it's going to be absorbed in the way that you would like it to be. And
so let's just make sure I've got the context here. So basically, we're talking about an advisor having a conversation with, let's just call it a client.
yeah,
And we're focusing more on the advisor to client side of the conversation as opposed to more so the listening side. So this is more about the advisor trying to understand what they want to say, how they want to say it, how it's received by the client. Or are we talking more about the interactive dialogue between the two here?
I appreciate you making that distinction because I think listening is probably the most important thing. And so it's better for us to focus on that. The way that we listen, what we take in, how we absorb that information. When I start work with my clients, I tell them often 90% of this is going to start out with me asking questions and listening. And then slowly over the course of the engagement, that might flip. So we can't expect the clients to have that kind of intentionality with what they're saying, which is why I explain sort of breaking down communication into different parts from the advisor's side. But listening, if you're only going to get good at one thing, listening's it. Because the way someone says it, when they say it, how they say it, it could mean a lot of different things. And forming a relationship with that person and checking your understanding with them. So it's, I'm hearing that retirement is really important to you, but you're also looking to prioritize doing really exciting things right now. Is that what you're sharing in this, what you just shared? Some sort of checking in to show that you're listening and also to make sure your understanding is correct is also really helpful. So
Right.
I was talking more about the back and forth.
Okay. So let's start with the first piece here, which is understanding what you want to say, kind of this developing the idea. So fill in some more on that, if you would.
I would say that this is something that advisors do advisors always do this. This is probably the piece that everyone has already done. It's all of the other pieces that I think get either forgotten or people don't realize that what you want to share, whether it's a savings rate or a way to purchase a home with getting a mortgage of this amount and then saving up this down payment. Advisors have already come up with the ideas, and they have, in terms of any advisor interaction I've had, the ideas are there. So I don't think that that's something that people need to work on. The piece that I'm suggesting they work on is, okay, you have the idea, you have to set your expectations, as a mentor of mine said. Set your expectations that you just saying it out loud, however you do and whatever words you choose, is not necessarily going to communicate that to your clients. And so that's why you have to think about how you're going to present it, and then also think about how it's going to be absorbed. So there have been a lot of discussions on different podcasts or presentations I've attended where people talk about, visual displays versus audio displays, and you talk to the client about how they like to receive information. I do think that's very helpful. But I also think tone and timing can be really important as well in terms of sharing these ideas. But really, at the end of the day, it's about knowing that communicating with someone else is a skill. It doesn't just happen. Just like, teaching is a skill. It's not just somebody standing in front of a classroom and saying, I'm an expert at this. I'm just going to, you're all awash in my expertise, and you're going to walk out of the classroom understanding it.
So let's take an example here. And let's say that we have a client and they are spending themselves into a hole. So they are spending more than they should. They're going to run out of money in retirement. Let's just use that as an example.
Yeah.
So how can I say that in a way that is going to be heard by the recipient in a way that is going to be received in a way that they're like, oh, I get it. I'm going to reduce my spending, or I'm going to find another way to increase my income so that I can continue spending at my current level.
Go right for the hard one, right, Steve?
Yeah. Well, yeah, I got to put my guests on the hot seat once in a while.
No, that's fine. I don't mind. No, I don't mind. I mean, I actually see that as breaking that down, again, similar to the psychotherapy with AI and the person. I have a lot of questions that come up. I actually break down that situation into a lot of other factors. So in terms of spending too much, right? So too much, where did that amount come from in terms of what they need in retirement? And this is me thinking out loud. This is not, me interacting with the clients, but for me as the advisor, where did that number come from, that too much number? And when they're spending too much, what is it that they're spending on? Is it a goal that they've stated with me that they wanted to spend? And if so, my ultimate aim would be to share with them, let's say that the amount that they wanted to spend in retirement was a number that they set and that we put into their projections. But the spending that they're doing right now is above the goal that they had for current vacations until retirement. It's much easier for me to sort of ground it in concrete goals. In that case, I think my role as the advisor would be well, first I'd like to say to them that my role as the advisor is not to say what's good or bad, what's right or wrong. However, that in listening to them, I've heard that their aim is to spend X amount in retirement. Based on this current pattern, that is not a possibility. So would you prefer to us to look at this retirement goal that you have and change it in light of your increased interest in vacation spending? Or would you like to talk about ways to continue to prioritize the retirement saving? I like to try to think about things in terms of what's important to them. My role is just to show the trade-offs and to make sure they understand the trade-offs and to set their expectations for if you continue with X, then you'll get Y. And Y's fine.
It's math.
If you're fine with Y, then okay. But it's all about trade-offs. And if that sounds good to you, that works. If that's not good with you, then we should discuss some changes. So it's a way of listening, understanding what they have said is important. Maybe what they have said is important is not as important. Maybe they feel like they're supposed to say that. And then just showing them information and presenting it as a choice to them.
And then how do you think about the conversation that you just described here relative to what technology might be able to do? Maybe going back to that psychotherapist example where the robot, the AI, would be interacting with the client, having this kind of dialogue. Where do you see the human being able to do a better job of saying it the right way, in positioning it the right way so that the client can understand it in a way that is effective for them? And so I'm kind of playing devil's advocate here just to
No,
take the technology side, but
I
I agree with you.
anticipated it.
I agree with you
anticipated
100% on the importance of being human. And I've talked about that in the past. So, but I'm really trying to see the extremes here, because I want everyone listening to this to really understand how important it is to really enhance our humanity. And we'll continue about that. But yeah, any thoughts on that?
Sure. Yeah, I'm happy to address it. I assumed that you would, make this a lively conversation. That's what you do on your podcast. So I welcome it. My guess, right, and I'm just guessing about a situation that I haven't even read about, is that the I'll just say robot for lack of a better term, that the robot would say you're spending too much. And I find it personally as a human difficult to, like, what am I going to do with that information? I mean, I'm just going to feel bad about my spending and then maybe be shamed into stop spending. But shaming someone into doing something is often not very effective. And it's really not great for building relationships. So that's where actually I see the failure. Maybe in this psychotherapy situation, the robot would not have responded with that kind of factual, you're spending too much, this isn't going to work. And I see the human being able to, ironically enough, try to take that judgment piece away, which flies in the face of what you said. The participant said that they didn't feel like they were being judged. So as a human, in my head, I think, oh, they're spending too much. But again, I don't think that's going to be effective. And so showing trade-offs instead and making it their choice and having them feel empowered to share what's important to them, to change their mind about what's important to them, and to provide a space for them to work through that. And then to see what the trade-offs are. That's where the knowledge of the industry comes in. That's where I see technology showing trade-offs. Virtual reality might allow people to actually picture themselves in Florida on the golf course and, see if they like it or see if they hate it. So I see a lot of roles for technology, but the human is able to understand, like, okay, people get their feelings hurt. And when people get their feelings hurt, they're certainly not going to take action that's beneficial. So how can I share this information in a way that feels neutral, compassionate, something they could take action on? So if machines can do that kind of work, I'm excited to read about it. But I do think that is the current advantage that humans have if we work at it.
Yeah, one of the things you said here just a minute ago, I think is really a point I want to expand on. You mentioned it's like, if they tell me I'm spending too much, it's like, well, what am I going to do with that information? And I was recording a podcast with Sarah Newcomb, who is with Morningstar, and she's a behavioral economist, a behavioral psychologist, one of those two. Mm-hmm. And one of the things she said is that we've got these 5 big personality traits. And there's been a lot of research that says we've got these 5 main personality traits or types. And she said, it's really hard to change our personality. Mm-hmm. And so when you said, what am I going to do with that? It made me think of if my personality is that I'm obsessive or whatever. I'm not saying that's one of the 5, but sure. If part of how I'm behaving is part of my personality, just telling me I need to change that is asking me to change my personality, which just isn't going to happen. So what she talks about is this idea of mindsets. And so she tries to focus on what are the mindsets that people have that I might be able, it's easier to change a mindset than it is to change a personality. And so what's a mindset that they might have that I can help them shine a light on, help them become aware of it, and then help them understand maybe a little different behavior that nudges them in a different direction that is in a more positive way that will help them. So the spending thing, maybe there's some kind of mindset that we can work on that we can nudge them in a different way. So maybe that's an example or way that as humans, we can think about some of these psychological things that maybe computers haven't quite caught up with yet, or maybe just the way our minds work, we might be better than computers at doing something like that.
Yeah, I mean, human beings are really messy. I think we really don't make a lot of sense. And so I guess that's why I find it difficult to think of, because I think technology often is very logical, and human beings are not very logical. There's a lot of things that just don't seem to connect. And one of the most helpful things that I have gotten out of therapy is the idea that two things can be true. So that idea in itself was very difficult for me to sort of absorb as an idea, but also, and artificial intelligence can probably grasp that, but I do think of computers as often being logical and following a set of rules. But with the idea that two things could be true, one avenue could make client more money, but the other, and that exists, but the other avenue actually is going to get the client the house they want faster, and they're about to have a child and they can afford it. So those two things can exist together as long as the client knows that, okay, this is not the dollars and cents answer, but based on the information you've shared with me, you can afford it. It is in your budget. This house is expensive, but you're about to have a child and you live in a, 1-bedroom apartment, and the timing works out really well right now. So buy the house. As long as they're comfortable with the fact that those two things are together. So I like the idea of mindsets. Reframing. I was reading on your website about the quote from Proust about seeing things with new eyes, and I think that's really what we as advisors can do: reframe things for clients as opportunities or as choices, as opposed to discipline or something they can't have.
And make sure that it's their idea. It's like, if it's our idea and we tell them, it's like, nah, I don't think I'm going to do that. But if they come up with it, now they've got some ownership. So, so let's talk about how it's heard by the recipient. So I think that might be your third point here. So how do we think about the way we say it and how it's heard by the recipient?
Yeah. Well, I'm going to pull this one out. Don't bore the clients. It's one of my favorite things that my dad said when he was reflecting on his teacher, being a teacher, and then other colleagues of his. He would just sort of, I can just see him in my head saying, like, don't bore the students. And I think the same thing with the clients. Sometimes finance can be really technical, and it's difficult to sort of break things down into flow charts and pictures and easy analogies. But understand they're an audience, and there's you could drop in some humor. There's a way to keep people engaged. There's a reason why TED Talks are successful. Because people are moving in a particular way, making particular eye contact. And so knowing that they'll be engaged will be helpful for them to get their attention. And then checking in with them to make sure that their understanding of what you're saying is, I don't want to say correct, but checking in to see if if their understanding is what you hope it is. Because we've all read the studies or heard the anecdotes about clients who felt uncomfortable in an advisor's office, didn't want to look stupid, and was like, yeah, that makes a lot of sense, but actually didn't understand what was happening. So, breaking it down in small pieces, checking in, and being engaged, being animated, having good posture, just recognizing what your role is, and that it's not a passive sharing of information. you are kind of a teacher, and you are, um, performer is a bad word to use in the financial industry, but you are someone who is trying to get people engaged in something that very rarely do they want to be engaged in.
At the beginning of each year, I do a little exercise that I call my 3 words. And the idea is I come up with 3 words that really try and encapsulate some of the key things that I want to work on, or whether it's accomplishments or just trigger words that make me realize, okay, yes, this is what my focus is for the year. And then I wrote a blog post about that, adjusting the idea in another way, which is,
Mhm.
and it applies to what you're just talking about here with don't be boring. And the idea is to come up with 3 adjectives that describe your personality. And they could be things like feisty, methodical, and quirky. So as you were talking about don't be boring, I'm thinking, well, maybe you can come up with this 3 adjective exercise and think about, here's how I view myself, and then go to your spouse, go to a friend who knows you well and says, if you had to come up with 3 adjectives that describe me, what would those be? So you can kind of compare how I feel about how I am
Mhm.
and how other people see me. But then if you come to some agreement there, then maybe you can think about how not to be boring is to accentuate those adjectives that describe yourself and use that as a way to communicate with your client, with your audience. And that way it's real because it's how you see yourself. It's how other people see yourself, but you're just accentuating it in such a way that is not boring. And keep it in mind, your idea of don't be boring, maybe you can meld those two, and maybe that's a way to think about it as well.
I love that because you're playing to your strengths, which is always helpful. You're doing some self-examination, which helps you understand yourself better, and then ultimately you'll be a better advisor. And I had a third thing. Hold on. I had a third point. Um, oh, confidence. If you do something you know and you feel confident about it, that gets projected and can often make people feel more comfortable with you as opposed to them being worried that you're self-conscious. So yeah, if you play to your strengths like that, if you take a good look at yourself, ask for some outside opinions, and then lead with those skill sets. Like, I'm very corny. I'll make puns. I'll joke around. I'll make fun of myself for being corny. And I think the fact that I embrace it, and then bring it to the table, add some lightness, and add some. I think people trust me easier because I'm corny and I'm fine with it, and I'll make a joke, and it's not so stiff, and it's me. It's authentic. It's easier to trust me then.
Mhm.
So
And
I
then I
think that's
think
good.
yeah, and I think your fourth point here was, what is the idea that's in the recipient's head as a result of the communication? So can you expand on that a bit?
I mean, I don't know if we're going to know what that is until we continue working with them through the plan. Um, I mean, I see that as a part of the process in terms of us as the advisors understanding what that idea is. It's more of, I think the most we can do is continue to listen and then to see if what the clients are saying or what their expectations are consistent with that idea that we have tried to convey. And there's nothing wrong with trying to say something again, as long as, again, it's presented not as a, I don't think you heard this right, because that's a very judgmental comment, but I know this is repetitive. I just wanted to share this because it's a concept I think is really important to the work that we're doing together. So there's nothing wrong with trying to say something in a different way, or even admit that maybe the first time you shared it, you were unhappy with how you shared it. I certainly don't think there's anything wrong with, um, it's okay to admit that you would like to have done something better. Like, I shared this the first time. I could have broken it down a little bit easier. Here's another way to talk about it. So admitting being wrong. I mean, granted, we have to be very careful in the financial industry to make sure that um, that we're following all the rules and don't open ourselves up to any sort of lawsuits. But but admitting that there's a better way you could have communicated something, I don't see that as a weakness. I see that as a strength. So I'll keep thinking about how you can get to what that idea is, but what exists in someone else's head, I think we can just do the best we possibly can to be intentional about making sure it's the action, the idea, the takeaway that we want it to be.
And so if we do have this idea that we want to communicate and we've described it, would it be appropriate then to say something to the client or to the prospect and say, I talked about blank, and I just want to make sure that we both understand what I mean by that. And so maybe you're basically, maybe you're asking them to state it back to you. Maybe you're restating it and say, does that make sense to you? Or would it be fair to say blank? Or do you have any questions about that? Somehow we're just trying to or confirm that they understood it in the same way that we tried to communicate it. Is that kind of what you're saying here about what's in the recipient's head?
Yeah, I mean, I think those are all the strategies that we can, I wouldn't recommend doing all of them. That's probably a little
Right.
overwhelming for the clients. But I do think that those are the tools we have right now. I like the idea of asking the client, again, depending on the relationship you have with them, of saying, because this is so important to the work that we're doing it together, or couch it in something about how important it is to their work, their goals, their plan. Could I ask you to share that back with me to make sure I'm doing my job in communicating it to you? So I like that the best. It seems to be the most straightforward. But I'm still learning as well. I just have now, I now really have the mission to know that I want to continue to get good at these skills, because I think these are going to be the standout skills. And again, I could be wrong, but they've made me a better person. So I certainly don't mind continuing to do this work because it's what I enjoy doing. And so if I'm wrong and the industry goes in a completely different direction and we have, robots doing all of the client meetings, well, then I'll take these skills and I'll go somewhere else. I know we're getting to the end of time, but I do want to mention, because I think it's really interesting, the New York Times had an article in March of 2019 called "Human Contact is Now a Luxury Good." And it was basically talking about how, as technology takes over more of our lives, the rarity of human contact has made it more of a prized commodity. And so that gives me some fuel for thinking that I might not be wrong, because people will interact with technology in so many other spaces. Being able to interact with a person will be a treat, a rarity. Not that I want that to be the case, but it's better. It melds with my sort of working hypothesis. So we'll see what happens.
Yeah, I don't think the demand for human advisors or the demand for human interaction or the demand for human services is going to go away ever. I mean, and the way I think about it is, for hundreds of years, people have been saying that because of technology, we're going to be working 10 hours a week, by a certain date. Well, that never happens. I mean, we're working more today than we've ever worked, yet we've got more technology than we've ever had. So I think it's just human nature that we're going to work. It's human nature that we want to hire other people to help do things for us as well. And so, and even looking today, we've got millions of job openings and we don't have enough people to fill those jobs. So I don't think the need for human work and human interaction is going to go away anytime soon. But
Mhm.
the things that you're talking about here, I think, are absolutely key for financial advisors, that we have to continue to hone those human skills, those things that make us uniquely human, and
Mhm.
the interaction with another human being. That's never going to go well. I shouldn't say never. I mean, because you just never know. But
It's hard to imagine it going away.
hard to imagine it going away. Yes. Yeah. So I think that's a safe bet to continue to improve these skills. And I very much appreciate you taking some time to share that with us. So Claire, is there anything else here that you want to wrap up with, or final closing comment here?
Um, I think what I'd like to say to sort of wrap it up is that technology is going to change the industry. The industry always changes, everything changes. And like you just alluded to, humans and humans interacting with other humans, it's difficult to see that going away. So it seems like a natural skill set to build. And also, I think it will improve the lives of our clients in really meaningful ways. So I think it's worth it to develop our skills in communication. I really would encourage people to think about big emotions like grief and how they could be better at stewarding those for their clients. And also it's helpful to even share resources. So there's a group called the Dinner Party for young people dealing with a loss. So people in their 20s and 30s dealing with a significant loss, knowing things like that. And, please, to anyone listening, share that their nonprofit called the Dinner Party. You can just Google them. Having resources at the ready, not just estate planning attorneys, but maybe even other aspects of the lives, because advisors talk to clients about pretty much their whole lives.
They do. So Claire, if people want to connect with you, is there a good way to connect? Social media, or what would be a best way for folks to stay in touch with you?
Oh, sure. I'm on LinkedIn, Clare Ciervo. I have as the header financial planner and advisor at Balanced Rock Investment Advisors. That would be the best way. I'm actually not on any other social media. My at work, look up the Balanced Rock website, balancedrockia.com. I'm on there too.
Excellent. All right, Claire, appreciate your time today, and thanks for all the great insights.
Great. Thanks, Steve.